Thank you very much, Barbara, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to what has been a really amazing series of talks so far. Oh, yeah, which was this one? This. Okay. What I'm going to talk to you about today is using passive acoustic monitoring, so listening to whales in the ocean and trying to use the sounds they make to tell us a little something about where they are, when they're there, and what different species might be doing. So we do know that marine mammals rely on sound probably more than any other sense. They use it to navigate, they use it to communicate with each other, they use it for foraging, for instance in the bubble net feeding humpback whales that Ari was talking about. They can use it to identify each other or to maintain group cohesion. Perhaps the best known use of sound by whales is reproductive display, in particular the songs of humpback whales. And they can also use it, as fin whales do, for group cohesion, so to maintain contact with each other while migrating. Now, because marine mammals, and I'll be talking just about whales, are so reliant on producing sound, we as scientists can take advantage of eavesdropping on the sounds they make to study them. One of the more interesting things about cetaceans is that they actually vocalize or produce sound in the broadest range of any animal on Earth. Oop, I guess I don't have a... From infrasonic, so below our hearing, which would be blue whales and fin whales, to ultrasonic, some of the porpoises and beaked whales. This one. I'm going back. And this just shows you a log frequency of frequency and the species. And so you can see that it's a very, very broad range. And depending upon your question of interest, when you're studying marine mammals using sound, you do have to take into consideration what tool you want to use, depending upon the frequency of the animal you want to study. So for instance, blue whales and fin whales that produce very low frequency sound, you can sample over much longer time scales. Most of our sampling nowadays is digital, so you won't fill your hard drive as quickly as if you're sampling at 192 kilohertz studying beaked whales. So I don't have any super duper animations to show you, but I would like to play a few sounds so that you can get a feel for the broad range of signals that are produced by whales. I'm so technologically... Okay, thank you. Now, if I were Chris Clark, I could imitate all these animals, but if it doesn't work, I'll try. Or maybe later tonight after a drink.
Yeah, it was working.
At any rate, so odontocetes tend to use clicking or echolocation to navigate, to find food. No, it's too low. And normally we hear about the songs of humpback whales, which are these elaborate acoustic displays, but in fact bowhead whales also sing, so I just thought I'd bring my own personal bias into this. Sperm whales. Okay. This is a bowhead whale song, and the song is thought to be a male display, either to potentially attract females or space between males so other males can identify the quality of the animal. Fin whales, and these are 10 times, are very low frequency, and they're much simpler. It's a very simple pulse. And then finally, courtesy of Jason Gadampi, is what I think is the weirdest, which is the minke whale.
Okay.
Yeah. This one. Okay. So, another nice thing about sound is that it can be heard over great distances. We can hear animals over much greater distances than, say, we can see them. And depending upon the frequency, signals can be detected from hundreds of meters to potentially hundreds of kilometers. low frequencies, such as those produced by blue and fin whales, which is what I'll be talking about later in the talk, can go quite far, and so we can detect them over great ranges. And Pat brought up the issue of scale, and one of the things we do need to take into account when we're discussing acoustic data is what is the scale over which we can hear these animals. And overall, most baleen whales produce relatively low frequency sound, which is why they've been the target of many of these long-term passive acoustic monitoring studies. And of course, animals, as I said, can be heard farther than seen, but you can also hear them in poor weather, in 24 hours a day, even when it's dark, and under ice. So you can detect animals year-round. I have an asterisk next to weather in that wind speed and ice noise can impact how far you might hear an animal or how far an animal might hear itself, as can anthropogenic noise. So I'm not going to go into much detail on these tools because that would be another talk altogether, but there are basically two processes in getting acoustic data. One is making the measurements, and that can be very small scale, such as using a dipping hydrophone, an underwater microphone, or you can go to a cable system, such as these big ocean observing systems. You can use towed arrays to compare visual surveys with acoustic surveys. But what I'm mainly going to talk about are data from moored hydrophones. And this is where you take an instrument, which it records onto the instrument, and deploy it in the ocean for 3 months to a year or 2 years. And then you have to recover the instrument to get your data back. Now, once you get the data back, and this is one of the big issues that I would say the bioacoustic community is struggling with, is we have terabytes of data. So while Ari might need a grad student or an undergrad to go through his dives, I feel like sometimes we need an army to go through terabytes and terabytes of data. And one of the ways we process the data in numerous ways to make it more efficient. You can use something called a long-term spectrogram, and I'll show you that, which is basically looking at a year's worth of data. We use automatic detection methods to go through the data and find signals of interest. And then nowadays, particularly on things like gliders, we're using special algorithms that both detect sounds and then classify them. So instead of sending back an actual time series of sound, you send back the time, the location, and what species the algorithm thinks it was. And one thing that I didn't point out here is that when you do put a hydrophone in the water, you're not targeting just a single species. You can target multiple species so long as they're making sounds. So I'm just going to provide 4 examples, 3 in a little more detail, on how passive acoustic monitoring, or PAM, can be used to study marine mammals. And first I'll talk about geographic variation, then broad-scale migrations, and then the potential for studying changes in populations over time. And these are things that Nick mentioned in his talk earlier today. So, the IWC was actually one of the first organizations that wanted to use acoustics to see if they could tell the difference between true or Antarctic blue whales and pygmy blue whales, particularly in areas where they might overlap. So we know that Antarctic blue whales make this 28 Hertz signal, and I'll show you a spectrogram shortly, and you saw it on both Christoph and Nick's presentations. And that same signal is recorded around the Antarctic. What we know about blue whales is they have geographic differentiation between the sounds they make. So in the North Pacific, there's a signal made in the Northeast Pacific, which is distinct from that of the Western Pacific. And the IWC was interested in trying to figure out if, instead of identifying animals at sea using visual cues, you might be able to identify them at sea using acoustic cues. And it turns out that, in fact, although there are many different pygmy blue whale call types, they are very distinct from the Antarctic blue whales. And then I'll talk briefly about some new research on southern hemisphere fin whales that looks like a certain aspect of their calls may be indicative of an acoustic population. So, just to put it as simply as possible, I'm showing you spectrograms of 5 different call types that have been attributed to blue whales. Down here on the left is the Antarctic 28 Hertz call. It's a very simple signal that's just a moan, And this has been recorded everywhere around the Antarctic with no geographic variation that we as people have been able to tell, although certainly the whales may be able to tell each other apart. And then you also see 4 examples of pygmy blue whale calls. From Madagascar on the left, up off of Sri Lanka in the northern Indian Ocean, Western Australia, and Rob Macaulay has a poster here which perhaps will address some of these animals, and then also in the Southeast Pacific. So these are all areas where both Antarctic blue whales and pygmy-type blue whales overlap in distribution. For fin whales, there's been some work recently showing that the interpulse interval, which is the time between each of these low pulses, may vary geographically. In the Antarctic, what it seems is that this high pulse, you can see these little commas up at about 90 hertz, that may be an indicator of different geographic populations of fin whales. And this is work that Anna Sharovic and then Jason Gadamke have been working on. And if you look at a very long-term spectrogram, so this is a year in the life of fin whales at 6 different sites in the Scotia Sea, you can see that this big bright line up here at around 90 hertz stands out very well above the noise. And by producing a long-term spectrogram of a year's worth of acoustic data, you can look at when the fin whales start and when they finish vocalizing. The reason these high-frequency pulses will be very useful for fin whales is that fin whales and blue whales overlap in the sounds they make. And so you can't see it in these plots, but there's actually a fair bit of energy from blue whales. And so the way to pick the fin whales out is to look at these high-frequency signals. So if we want to use acoustics to track, and this is very broad-scale population tracking, not the tracking of individuals, we can ask, where do Antarctic blue whales go in the winter? So from passive acoustic data, moorings that were put out in these locations, we know that we receive blue whale 28 hertz calls more or less from February to April right in the Antarctic. In Crozet, and this is work by Flore Samaran, Antarctic blue whales were recorded year-round. And I should step back and say that at some of these other locations, there are low levels of blue whale calling year-round, but the peaks occur basically in autumn primarily. Now, up in the Indian Ocean and also in the eastern tropical Pacific, we receive these same calls in the winter, so May through July and July through August. And we might be tempted, and we have no information from the Atlantic or from the western South Pacific. We might be tempted to assume that, oh, well, these animals are moving north and south roughly in this sort of pattern. But we do know from discovery tag data that certainly blue whales have been tagged in one end of the Antarctic and killed 180 degrees on the other side, and that these whales are recorded all around the Antarctic. So in this case, I think acoustics has given us some idea that some Antarctic animals migrate to much lower latitudes, but it doesn't tell us very much about, say, the population associations or different feeding aggregations, like Alex showed us with the humpback whales. And I'd also like to point out that most of our acoustic detections are in the fall and winter. And we know the blue whales are there, and fin whales, in the summer. So here we have a mismatch between what our acoustics tell us and what we know from visual surveys and whaling data. So the last topic that I'm going to talk about is long-term monitoring. And this is one of the things that we're going to try to do through SORP. If you can listen in an area long enough, you can see patterns and potentially even look at increases or changes in the population. The upper panel shows 15 years of acoustic data from the North Pacific. And what sticks out most in this is you can see how very regular fin whales, these are fin whales, show up every year seasonally. In the panel below is 5 years off of Western Australia from comprehensive test band treaty data, and this is from Jason Gadamke. And what you can see here is, I think, the 28 hertz Antarctic blue whales, but you also have pretty faint signals of Australian blue whales. So we can take data like this and look at the relative change potentially in abundance of animals. So this is the North Pacific fin whale data. And again, you can see now we have the acoustic data translated into counts. And if you look at the bottom, we show the average number of whale call detections per year. And you can see that there's actually an increase from 1996 to 2003 when these data were analyzed, whether you do it by year or by date. So that suggested to us that either there's more fin whale calling, there's more fin whales, or there's been potentially a shift in distribution. I would certainly like to think that it's an increase in fin whale populations. And we're hoping to do this using some of the Antarctic data. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about very briefly is the other idea of using acoustics as a needle in a haystack, so to listen for very rare species. In some cases, BIOPS sonobuoys have been used to acoustically detect North Pacific right whales and get photo IDs and biopsies. We're hoping there's a project now that SORP is doing to do this for Antarctic blue whales, and I think there's currently an ongoing cruise off South Australia. And they're planning on using, rather than all these ship surveys that Nick pointed out, listen for blue whales, go to where they are, and then get your photos, your biopsies, and deploy satellite tags. So this is a way that acoustics can be used to direct other research. Another thing that acoustics have been used for is basically deploying moorings in former habitats where low densities of animals are expected, and it's just not cost effective to do a shipboard survey. This has worked well for North Pacific right whales, for Spitsbergen bowhead whales, and for Antarctic blue whales. So whenever you put a hydrophone out in the water, you're always going to be surprised and you're always going to hear something new. However, there are caveats. We can't say anything about the animals that are not making noise. And for baleen whales in particular, we don't know who vocalizes. It's thought that it's males who produce these songs, but all baleen whales make a number of other sounds. We don't know how often they vocalize, what proportion of the population, or why. And these are all behavioral contexts to sound production that will help us better interpret these long-term moorings. And again, different sounds are used for different purposes. So I was on a cruise down to the Antarctic several years ago, and we had sonobuoys and we were listening to blue whales, and we heard a few of these 28 hertz sounds, but mostly what we heard were what we call decalls, these downsweep calls that are thought to be potentially a feeding call or a communication call. And I would say that decalls have been largely ignored in most of the literature, and that the type of call that you record can tell you something about what the animal is doing. And of course, animals may vocalize more during some seasons than other, and I think I showed that on the Antarctic slide, where we have animals vocalizing primarily in fall and winter, but we know they're there at other times of the year. And the environment, of course, influences the detection distance. So if we want to know how far away we can hear animals or how far away they can hear themselves, we need to know quite a bit about the physical environment. So I guess my take-home message, and I could have started with this, Lisa, is passive acoustic monitoring can tell you a lot, especially in remote areas that are not regularly visited by ships and where the weather might be too rotten to do other traditional surveys. But really, it's best to integrate all of these data in terms of acoustics and tracking and a lot of the behavioral ecology. And I think we've seen that in the use of tags that do recordings and can tell you more about, for instance, the sound speed profile, or I guess you would call it the thermocline. But I would encourage all of us, and I think this symposium is doing a really good job of working together and bringing our data together. So briefly, I just wanted to talk about the SORP Blue and Fin Whale Acoustics project. And the point of this is to analyze current moored hydrophone data from around the Antarctic. And there's a lot, but it's from different instruments and different times of year. Look at seasonal and diel variation of blue and fin whales. Look more into the geographic variation of fin whales, and then decide what are the best techniques for analyzing these terabytes of data. And then, based on this, determine what are the best locations, what's the best instrument, and who are partners for long-term acoustic monitoring. And then, of course, as I mentioned, use DIFAR sonobuoys to find blue whales for photo ID, biopsy, and satellite telemetry. And I just wanted to put up here, I presented data from a number of different sources, and I just wanted to acknowledge all of those sources from published and unpublished data. And of course, the big name missing here is SORP, so I'd certainly like to thank them for their support. Thank you.